Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at UniFi Firewall Rules. If you're a UniFi user, whether new or existing, this is arguably the most important section of your entire setup. Last week we went over a basic configuration of a UniFi network, but today we're going to dive fairly deep into UniFi Firewall Rules so that you can understand exactly how they work to create firewall rules that you'll need for your network. The very first step before even configuring a single firewall rule is understanding exactly how UniFi Firewall Rules work. This is the most important section of this video, and if you understand this, you'll be able to implement just about any firewall rule you need, with a few exceptions that I'll highlight later. Now, there are three types of rules that you'll need to understand: in, out, and local. Then there are three categories of rules: internet, LAN, and guest. When you configure a firewall rule, you'll have to select the type of rule it will be, but you'll also have to configure a source and destination. The source or destination can be a single IP address, multiple IP addresses, or an entire network. The source and destination are pretty straightforward, but the type, meaning in, out, and local, is where things can get confusing, and mainly because in and out kind of function the same but are very different. Using a basic example, if you wanted to block access from your IoT network to your LAN network, the source would be the IoT network, the destination would be the LAN network, the action will be drop, which we'll explain later, but the type would be LAN in. Now, funny enough, if you selected LAN in or LAN out, the rule would work the exact same. Traffic would be blocked from the IoT network to the LAN network, but the traffic would pass through your UniFi firewall before being blocked, and that's the difference between LAN in and LAN out. LAN in traffic is blocked when the traffic is coming into the firewall, while LAN out traffic is blocked when traffic is leaving the firewall. You don't want your firewall routing all of this traffic unnecessarily, especially if the end result is to actually block it. So LAN in will block the traffic on the source side as opposed to the destination side. This is the exact same for internet in and internet out, as well as guest in and guest out, which we'll talk through in a little bit. The only other type of rule to be aware of is local. Unlike in and out, local is traffic that is destined for the UniFi router itself. An example being DNS. DNS is what translates a domain name into an IP address, and generally, your router will forward that traffic to the correct DNS server. So if you wanted to allow DNS traffic, you'd create a LAN local rule because it's destined for the router, as opposed to a LAN in or LAN out rule. Now, the UniFi firewall allows traffic by default. So generally, your job is to block traffic that you don't want passing through your network rather than having to allow it. But there are a few different ways to do it. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and the demo will hopefully help explain this a little more, but understanding in, out, and local is the bulk of the challenge, and then you can utilize things like network isolation to make things a little easier. Okay, so we are at just about the exact same point that I left off at in the last video. The only difference is that I did a few things that I'll talk through as we go along. But as I said earlier, by default, the UniFi firewall allows all traffic. So we're actually going to be blocking traffic as opposed to allowing traffic. So in the last video, this is the only thing that we created. I just came in and I paused this. And a simple firewall rule works, and it works well. The way that simple firewall rules work, in essence, is that you'll generally use them either with this IP address or with the actual network. And in essence, you can come in here and create some fairly sophisticated firewall rules, but in a very simple way. You basically come in and block or allow traffic, and then you'll come in here and select either from an IP address or a local network, and that's kind of it. We did that in the last video. We're going to be focusing on advanced firewall rules at this point. So rather than simple, we're going to come in here to advanced. Now, the first thing that you're going to see is this isolate rule here. This isolate rule is for our surveillance VLAN, which is what we created earlier. So if we go into the actual surveillance VLAN, you're going to see that isolate network is checked off. If you come in and uncheck that, and then you go back to the actual firewall rules, and you refresh this page, you'll see that that rule is disappeared. So in essence, all that checkbox does is it creates a firewall rule for you. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to turn that back on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to check out this firewall rule. So what you can see is that the action is drop, the type is LAN in. So like I said earlier, traffic coming into the firewall. The source is our surveillance network, and then the destination is 6 networks. So these 6 are our actual VLANs here. So what you'll see is that if we come in and create a new VLAN, so this is the new VLAN, all it's going to be is 192.168.70.1. If we go back then to that firewall rule, what you're going to see is that it is added. So what isolate does is it basically blocks all traffic from that specific VLAN to any other VLANs that you have. And it will update itself as you make changes. So if you have a surveillance VLAN or an IoT VLAN, that realistically might be the only thing you have to do if you want to ensure that that network can never access any other networks, as the rule itself will update as time goes on. That's isolate network. Now, if we go back to our networks and we go to the guest network, so in our guest network, I turned off this guest network option. And if we come in and check out our firewall rules, you're going to see that nothing exists here. However, if we go back and we turn this on and then we come in and refresh this page, you're going to see that there are a bunch of firewall rules at this point. So these are all the firewall rules that are created just by coming in here and turning on this guest network. It's for various things. It's for the actual hotspot portal. It's for DNS. It's for blocking all of your other networks, etc. So what you really do when you use some of those options is you're just creating firewall rules. It's just that UniFi handles it on their own. The same is true for this allow internet access. If you uncheck that, it will create a firewall rule. This is for the surveillance, but it will block traffic to the internet. So these three checkboxes are actually extremely powerful in the sense that if you purely want to isolate one VLAN from accessing everything else, you can basically come in here, turn on this isolate network feature or this guest network feature if it's a guest network, determine if you wanted to actually access the internet, and that's it. Now it's only one way, so it's only this one VLAN from accessing your other VLANs. But what if you wanted to create a firewall rule that blocked access to other local networks, but not all of your other local networks? In that case, you would not be able to use this isolate network feature. So let's create a firewall rule. So we're going to use the advanced interface like I said. We have in, out, and local for the internet, LAN, and guest. And then there's also the same rules for v6 as well if you're using IPv6. Generally, when you're creating a firewall rule, especially between your VLANs, it's almost always going to be LAN in, except for unique situations like VPNs, which we'll take a look at later. So we're going to create a firewall rule that says block trusted to development. Development is one of my VLANs. Trusted is one of my VLANs as well. So in the action here, you have three actions. You can either accept traffic, which by default, like I said, all traffic is allowed. So generally, you're not going to do this unless you're using it in conjunction with another block rule, which you could, that we'll talk about in a minute. The majority of the time, you're going to use drop. Drop will just drop the packet, unlike reject, which will actually inform the originator that it is being rejected. Generally, you'll create drop rules, but there might be unique situations where you'll create reject rules, but using drop is probably the safest way. Next is protocol. You can come in here. There's a bunch of different protocols. You're probably not going to use almost all of these. However, you will use TCP, UDP, and probably ICMP. But if you're blocking traffic between networks, you should just block everything. After that, we're going to select the network, and we're going to select network down here. So again, this is the source and the destination. So the source network is going to be trusted. We're blocking trusted to development. So trusted and then development. And at this point, this firewall rule is created. So if we add the rule, what you'll see is that it will come in here at the top. Now, firewall rules execute from top to bottom. You don't really have to worry about it with the UniFi Firewall because it's not going to allow you to put it under your allow rules. That's just one of the nice user interface changes, because if you were allowed to move it, you wouldn't actually block anything. But you have to know that because you might create this with a block rule, and the allow rule has to be above the block rule, otherwise you will drop the packet. So this is about as basic as it gets. But like I said earlier, what if you actually wanted to block multiple VLANs at this point? Well, with the advanced rule, you really can. You can go back to a simple rule and then select which networks you want to block, or you can use something called port and IP groups. So here, rather than selecting network, you would select port/IP group. And then at that point, you have two options here, address group and port group. Now, these are created and managed by profile. So in the profiles tab, if you go to IP groups, these are two that I created, which we'll use later. Now, you can create a new profile here, and I just call this management and surveillance. And this is the management subnet, and this is the surveillance subnet. So if you add this, and then you go back to that firewall rule, what you will see is that we can change this to port/IP group, and then we can do management and surveillance. And then if we apply the changes, what we're doing is we're blocking the trusted network from accessing the management and surveillance networks. Now, port and IP groups are generally used for a few different things, but one of the most common is RFC 1918. This is every single local IP address that you can possibly use. So what people do is they come in and they create a RFC 1918 profile. They add these 3 subnets. And then what this will ensure is that if you went back to your firewall rule and you blocked traffic to RFC 1918, so from trusted to RFC 1918, this network would not be able to access any private IP address ever other than what's on the actual VLAN itself. So that's one of the common IP profiles that a lot of people use. Another common option is port profiles. So if you came in here, you can actually go through and create, rather than an IP profile, a port group. And you can type in specific ports. And then at this point, you could actually block traffic to, let's say, the router itself. So if you wanted to block traffic to the router itself, you can come in here and create a management interface port profile, add all the ports that you actually want to block. And then if you go back to that individual firewall rule, rather than blocking the actual address groups, we're going to block the port groups. But like I said earlier, it's not going to be LAN in, it's going to be LAN local, because you're trying to block access to the actual management interface of your UniFi firewall at that point. So remember, to talk this through one more time, LAN in is traffic that is going into the firewall, but it is not traffic that is destined for the firewall. So in this case, if you're trying to access the router itself, you're trying to access something that is destined for the router itself. In that case, you have to use LAN local. But if you're trying to access another VLAN, you're trying to not only go into the firewall, but you're actually trying to go out of the firewall as well to access another VLAN. And that's why you can actually use LAN in or LAN out, but you should use LAN in. So LAN in, LAN out, LAN local, when you're actually creating firewall rules for your specific VLAN, you're generally going to use LAN in and LAN local. You'll probably very rarely use LAN out. You will use LAN out when it comes to VPNs, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that's how you can actually block traffic from a specific VLAN to another VLAN. Now, you can also do it with actual IP addresses. So if you wanted to block one IP address from accessing an entire network and it had a static IP address, you could go in here, type in the IP address, come in here, type in the network. You could select whatever the network is. And then this rule at this point would drop traffic for this specific IP address from accessing this network. So as soon as you understand how all of this works, it starts to make a little more sense. And we're going to create all the firewall rules for this network here. I'm probably going to make changes, but I wanted to explain how generally these firewall rules work before we go on to actually doing that. The only thing I want to talk through is VPNs. So I came in and I set up this VPN, which is in essence just connecting this network that I'm on right now. I'm not connected directly to this UDM Pro Max. I'm connected to a different network and I am doing it through the website here. So now we're actually connected through and I'm tunneling all traffic by using the UniFi VPN. So this is all set up. So what I want to quickly show you is if we come in here, we're going to try to access this UNAS Pro. It's at 10.2.1.88. So you'll see that if I start to ping it, we're going to be able to access it. If I come in here and I type in its IP address, I can access it. Now, what we're going to do is create a firewall rule to try and restrict access from this VPN subnet to that specific device, or that entire subnet is probably better. Unfortunately, UniFi doesn't set up VPNs as their own network interface. It's done that way on other firewall devices. It's not done that way on UniFi devices. So what you realistically have to do is come in here and create a port profile for your specific VPN. So I just came in and created a port profile, WireGuard. This is the actual VPN server's subnet, and that's good. So what we're going to do is come in here and create a new firewall rule. And we're going to block traffic from WireGuard to the trusted VLAN. So we're going to drop the traffic. We're going to use port/IP group. We're going to select WireGuard. We're going to set it as LAN in, but this isn't going to work, and I'm going to show you that. So we're going to change this to network, and then we're going to change this to trusted. So based on what we've learned up to this point, you would think that this rule would work. We're trying to block traffic from our WireGuard VPN to our trusted VLAN. We're going to add the rule, and what you're going to see is that traffic is going to continue to work. And the reason for this is because the VPN is originating from the firewall itself. It's not originating from a specific local network. So when you're using firewall rules, you're not using LAN in, you're using LAN out. This is the one scenario where generally you're only going to create LAN out rules, at least in my experience. So if you come in here and change this to LAN out, and you apply the changes, what you'll see is in a second here, this traffic is going to stop. And the traffic's going to stop because we're blocking traffic from the actual firewall itself, which is where the VPN server is hosted, to a local network. And at that point, we're not ever going into the actual firewall itself. We're only going out of the firewall itself. So if you wanted to block your VPN from accessing various different VLANs, you have to do it using LAN out rules. That's the only way that it's going to work. So remember, from local network to local network, you're almost exclusively going to use LAN in, especially if you're dropping the traffic. From VPN to local network, you're almost always going to use LAN out because you're not ever actually originating from anything other than the VPN server itself, which is hosted on your UniFi Firewall. So that's kind of important to understand how all of that works and the distinction. So now that we did LAN in, out, and local, I want to take a look at internet in, internet out, and internet local. You're probably not going to do this very frequently, but I at least want to show you how it works. So what I did is I went in and did something that you should never do, but since this is a test network right now, I don't care. I created an RDP rule that will allow me to RDP into a device from anywhere in the world. So this is something that you should absolutely not do. If you want to do this, use a VPN. But what I want to show you is that 10.0.133, that's the actual device, 3389 is the port. And what happens when you actually port forward on a UniFi router, what it does is it comes in and it creates an internet in rule for you. So this allows you to actually access the device. The problem is that right now it's accessible to the entire world. So rather than using RDP, you can think of something like Plex. If you wanted to allow Plex to the external world, you would come in here, use port 32400. This would be the IP address of your Plex server. At that point, anyone in the world can access Plex. But generally, especially with port forwarding, what you want to do is lower this and kind of think of it like a funnel. You want to take the entire world and limit that down as much as you can. So what you can do is you can create other firewall rules that will actually block access to the entire world while also allowing access to the IP addresses that you want. And that's what these two rules right here do. So drop RDP. This is a very basic rule. It basically says drop any traffic. And then if you go back here, I have another rule, RDP, do not do this because you shouldn't do this, but we're allowing traffic in on the TCP port to a set of IP addresses. This is just a second network that I have. This is just the IP address for that, but it actually matches the exact same thing. So the local IP address, 3389. What you'll see is that port 3389 is open to the entire world right now. And also what you'll see is if I try and connect here, it will work as expected. So we're going to cancel out of here. We're going to resume this rule. And now this is dropping all traffic. So then at that point, if we come back to this port checker and we check the port, what you will see is that the port is blocked. So now if we try and connect through RDP, it's not going to work because it's not actually allowing any traffic into that RDP port. But if I cancel out of here, I go back to these rules and I resume this rule. And like I said, this allow RDP group just has the external IP address of this specific device that I'm connected to. If we come in here, the port will still be blocked for the rest of the world. However, if I try and connect to it, it's going to work. And the reason it's going to work is because we have internet in rules that are used in conjunction with a drop rule. And you need this drop rule because if you don't, you're not actually going to drop any of the traffic on that port. You need to have this drop rule. And that's why order is important, because the allow rule has to be above the drop rule. But as long as you have it configured this way, you will actually limit down exactly who can access it. So using Plex as our example, you would limit Plex down to this specific IP address or a range of IP addresses. So that's what Internet In does. Internet Local, I'm not going to show this. Internet Local basically just says if you wanted to access this specific firewall's management interface from the external world, you can create an internet local rule. You would not do that, especially because you can do it through UniFi's site manager, so you wouldn't do that, but that's internet local. And then internet out rules would really just be used if you wanted to block internet for a specific device inside of your local network. So it kind of works the same as LAN in, LAN out, and LAN local, but kind of from the different direction. So internet in is internet in from the external world into the actual UniFi router. Internet out is devices internally trying to get out to the external world. And then internet local is just to the UniFi router itself. So now that we did all that, this is going to be a pretty basic walkthrough of me creating some firewall rules for this network. Now, it's probably not going to be everything because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I want to show you a realistic scenario for a fairly sophisticated network. It's not super sophisticated, but it's fairly sophisticated. So there's a lot of VLANs. I'm going to come in here and get rid of this test VLAN because I don't need it. But we're going to go through and create some of these firewall rules. So right off the bat, I know that the IoT network I want isolated and I want it to have internet access. We're going to apply those changes. I know the guest network should be a guest network. It should allow internet access, and I don't have to isolate the network because by default, we're actually blocking that traffic anyway. So this is all the networks that the guest network cannot access. So this guest network option kind of isolates the traffic as well as allowing all the other stuff. So in that case, this is good. Now, this is where things are going to get a little bit more complicated. So for the trusted network, I want the trusted network to be able to access everything, but realistically, I don't need it to access like the guest network. So what I'm going to do is come in here and I'm actually just going to create a simple firewall rule because I really don't need anything else. So I'm going to come in here, local network. So it's going to be source to destination, and I'm going to stop the trusted network from accessing the guest network. Everything else, I want this network to be able to access. So at this point, we're good. We're going to block the traffic. Everything here is good. Next is going to be the actual surveillance network. Now for the surveillance network, it's going to be a little different because rather than using this isolate network feature, I'm actually going to use that RFC 1918 IP group that I created earlier. And mainly because as time goes on, I'm going to probably be creating things like site-to-site VPNs, and I'm going to have a few different VPN servers running on here. And I don't want this network ever accessing anything. This is probably the least trusted devices on my entire network. So I don't only want to isolate the traffic from this, I want to isolate the traffic from everything. I will keep this allow internet access unchecked here because I don't need to create unique firewall rules for this. But I'm going to apply those changes. And then what we're going to do is go into the profiles. And in the IP groups, I'm going to do two things. So the RFC 1918 is good. But for the management interface, I'm just going to add the SSH port in case of anything. And I'm going to apply that. And then we're going to go back to the firewall rules. And what we're going to do is create a advanced firewall rule for LAN in. And we're going to block the surveillance to RFC 1918. We're going to drop the packets. We're going to come in here and select the actual surveillance network. And we're going to come down here and port IP group. We're going to change this to RFC 1918. And we're going to add this rule. Now in this section here, we have block surveillance to RFC 1918. That's good. But remember, this network would still be able to actually access the management interface because we're only creating one LAN in rule and we're not creating any LAN local rules. So we're also going to create a second rule for this, and we're going to block the surveillance to the firewall ports. We're going to drop the traffic. We're going to change this to network. And then we're going to come down here, select surveillance. We're going to go to port IP group. We're going to change this actual port group to the management interface, but rather than LAN in, it's going to be LAN local. So we're basically saying the surveillance VLAN cannot access any of these ports, which is 80, 443, and 22. I might change that later. I have to look up exactly which ports you should block. But right now it can't access 80, 443, and 22, and then we're going to add that rule. Now to show you how all this works, I'm just going to come in here, and these are the two rules that we actually created. And I'm going to pause them, and we're going to test this all out. Okay, so what we're going to do to test this is we're going to ping the UNAS Pro. So this is the UNAS Pro. Everything is working as expected. But what we're going to do is come back to our firewall rules, and then we're going to resume this specific rule, which if we then minimize this in a second here, this should stop working because we just blocked traffic to all local IP addresses that you can possibly use. And you will see that there we go. The traffic has stopped. Now, if we come here and try and access our firewall, you will see that we are actually able to access it. And the reason we're able to access it is because that LAN local rule was disabled. So if we come back in here, we go to LAN local, and then we change this back and we resume this. If we try and access this again, we won't be able to because we blocked it. But remember, the way we blocked it is by actually accessing this port. So you can still access it for DNS and stuff like that, but you can't actually access it on that port, which for the surveillance VLAN is fine. Now, this development VLAN realistically shouldn't be able to actually access anything else either, and that's fine. I'm not super worried about doing this because there's not going to be untrusted devices on this, but the only exception to this is I might try to punch holes in this in the future if I needed to access other devices, but punching holes, in essence, just means being able to access specific devices on specific ports rather than blocking it in entirety. So as crazy as that sounds, these basic firewall rules that we just created will, in essence, block everything. So the only exception to what I'm going to change is rather than blocking the surveillance, I'm actually going to block everything from accessing the management interfaces. So I just came in here, I created a new profile, block to management interfaces. This is the IoT, the surveillance, the development, as well as the guest networks. I'm going to create that, and I'm going to come to this LAN local rule, and I'm just going to change this from the surveillance VLAN, and I'm just going to change this to that specific IP group that I just created so that everything in that specific group won't be able to access it. So at this point, like I said, this is a pretty sophisticated firewall rule setup in the grand scheme of things. But it was done extremely easily, mainly because these specific checkboxes are super, super powerful as soon as you understand how they work. But looking at what we've looked at, hopefully you can go through and create all the firewall rules you need to ensure that your local network has the correct firewall rules in place. That's about it from a firewall perspective. There's a lot there, and you can create some pretty complicated firewall rules, but I'm hoping that this video helped explain some of the differences between everything and how this all works. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. But other than that, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.